I did not set out looking for anything controversial. The notes in front of me were meant to be routine measurements taken beneath aging river crossings, whose stonework predated modern reinforcement programs by more than a century. Bridges credited to Tartarian-era construction had always drawn attention for their ornamentation and improbable durability. But what caught my eye was not above the waterline, it was below it. In several locations, the lower arches were sealed behind compacted earth and brick infill, their curves disappearing into embankments that engineering reports treated as natural slopes. Survey drawings from different decades repeated the same quiet anomaly. Original foundations sat far deeper than present streets, sometimes by several meters, as though the surrounding terrain had risen after the structures were completed. The language used to describe this shift was cautious, almost evasive: stabilization, later fill, urban leveling. No single phrase suggested anything dramatic, yet the accumulation of them felt deliberate. Municipal files introduced the first human silhouettes in this story, not through voices, but through handwriting. Surveyors logged elevations, engineers recalculated load tolerances, archivists stamped permits, authorizing new roadbeds. Without explaining why the old ones lay buried, their roles overlapped without intersecting, each department treating the altered ground as an inherited condition rather than a problem worth reopening. Standing beside one river crossing, I traced the line where masonry vanished into soil. The stones below were identical to those above, carved with the same care, cut to the same tolerances. They did not look like foundations. They looked like architecture meant to be seen. That realization lingered longer than I expected. Not fear, not certainty, just a thin, persistent doubt about why something built so carefully now sat hidden, and why the records spoke around it instead of through it. The bridges were no longer isolated once I began looking outward from their embankments. In several towns, the same curious relationship appeared between river crossings and the structures that clustered nearby. Buildings whose lower levels were officially described as basements carried arched windows framed with carved stone, lintels too decorative for rooms meant to be buried, and doorways that opened onto earth instead of streets. Some were bricked shut, others had been reduced to narrow slits, as though light itself had become an inconvenience. Property records introduced new institutional presences without faces. Municipal planners approved grade adjustments. Assessors reclassified square footage after renovations that quietly removed entire floors from public access. The language remained technical, procedural, stripped of curiosity. No document questioned why the lowest stories of civic buildings looked identical to the upper ones, or why ornamental masonry appeared at depths that should never have required it. I traced the pattern from one district to another, then across regions separated by hundreds of miles. Different architects, different decades of modification, the same architectural grammar, repeating beneath modern sidewalks, windows where retaining walls should have been, entrances that now led nowhere, decorative flourishes pressed against compacted soil. It was no longer a single structure asking to be explained. It was a category. The sensation was subtle at first, a tightening rather than a jolt, the kind that comes when coincidence stretches too far to remain comfortable, and paperwork keeps insisting that nothing unusual has happened at all. Maps changed before my eyes once I began stacking them chronologically. Early street plans showed riverbanks sitting lower, bridge approaches descending gently into water, civic buildings fronted by broad staircases that led directly to ground level. Later editions fattened those same areas, thickened the roads, erased the steps, and labeled the lowest stories of once prominent structures as sublevels. The transformation was incremental, almost polite. No single revision admitted to altering the terrain. Each one merely updated it. Renovation permits echoed the same quiet choreography. New pavements authorized decades after original construction. Drainage projects that required importing vast quantities of fill. Utility trenches cut through soil layers that did not match surrounding geology. Urban surveys recorded the results with clinical efficiency, noting elevation increases without recording their origin. ledger margins filled with annotations that solved practical problems while sidestepping historical ones. The characters here were not people so much as processes, planning boards, public works departments, survey offices that passed files between themselves until responsibility dissolved into paperwork. No document expressed alarm. None asked why multiple cities, separated by geography and politics, were all raising their streets over stonework that appeared designed to meet open air. The pattern hardened into something less accidental. What had begun as buried arches and sealed windows now looked like coordinated regrading on a continental scale. Curiosity slipped into something sharper. A suspicion formed, not from spectacle, but from how carefully every record avoided naming the change it had just described. By the time I began laying photographs and survey sketches side by side, geography stopped offering comfort. River crossings in different climates, cities separated by borders and languages, civic buildings attributed to the same architectural lineage all shared the same quiet feature. Their lowest arches disappeared into earth. Their first stories were now described as subterranean. Their approaches had been raised, paved, and repurposed without ceremony. The repetition was precise enough to be unsettling. Not identical in decoration, but identical in consequence. Stonework, truncated at the same relative heights. Window frames bricked over at matching depths. Staircases that once descended into open plazas now vanished behind retaining walls. The measurements echoed each other too closely to dismiss as chance. Different surveyors, different decades. The same vertical adjustments. I resisted the temptation to name what this might imply. Instead, I kept counting. Cities where rivers had been redirected. Towns where new embankments appeared without corresponding flood records. Bridges whose original clearance above water made sense only if the surrounding terrain had once been lower. Coincidence thrives on isolation. Patterns do not. The realization did not arrive at drama. It crept in, carried by columns of numbers and repeated annotations, by the growing weight of examples that refused to contradict one another. The more locations I added, the narrower the margin for accident became, until coincidence itself began to look like the most fragile explanation available. The paperwork changed tone once geology entered the conversation. Core samples extracted during drainage upgrades describe bands of compressed earth layered cleanly over finished stone. River management reports noted sediment deposits far thicker than seasonal flooding typically produced. Engineering assessments treated those layers as load-bearing realities, not anomalies, calculating reinforcement needs without questioning how such uniform strata had arrived in the first place. I traced the language carefully. Silt, alluvium, redeveloped ground, each term carried a suggestion of natural process, yet none accounted for the depth involved or for how consistently those deposits sealed. Arches, stairways, and ornamental masonry that should never have been buried at all. In flood histories, the dates drifted. Some regions recorded catastrophic surges, others showed nothing severe enough to justify meters of new terrain. The silence was as instructive as the data itself. When charts failed to overlap, footnotes multiplied. When flood maps contradicted elevation surveys, the discrepancy went unexplored. The documents did not argue with one another. They simply stopped speaking of the same places. Disturbance replaced curiosity then, not as panic, but as a slow recalibration of what counted as plausible. Natural explanations still hovered in reach, but they were beginning to bend under their own weight, forced to stretch farther with every buried arch and sealed doorway that refused to remain isolated. The stone itself told a different story than the paperwork did. I kept returning to bridges credited to Tartarian era construction, to civic halls whose lower tiers now sat behind earthworks and retrofitted retaining walls. Their buried sections carried the same ornamental vocabulary as the portions still visible to the street: carved cornices, fluted pilasters, keystone arches shaped with ceremonial care. None of it resembled the rough, utilitarian masonry usually reserved for foundations. Load calculations preserved in engineering archives hinted at original intentions. Stress diagrams assumed lateral exposure. Drainage channels were carved outward, not upward. Decorative courses ran continuously below current grade, stopping only where later infill began. These structures had been designed to breathe open air. Blueprints and engravings introduced the builders only as outlines, names etched beneath copperplate drawings, figures reduced to initials in contracting ledgers. Their lines traced sweeping approaches to riverbanks and grand stairways, descending into plazas that no longer existed. No sketch accounted for soil pressed against archways or windows reduced to vents. The contrast sharpened into something difficult to ignore. Architecture, meant to impress, now functioned as buried infrastructure, grandeur compressed into darkness. What unsettled me was not that cities had changed, but that they had changed in ways that inverted the logic of the original designs, transforming public facades, caps, into subterranean afterthoughts without leaving behind a record of why. The more documents I requested, the thinner the folders became. Correspondence logs jumped from one year to another without explanation. Engineering reports ended mid-sentence, their conclusions replaced by blank pages or summary tables that referenced attachments no longer present. Entire project files that should have chronicled massive street-level alterations existed only as catalog numbers, their contents marked, transferred, relocated, or simply unavailable. Municipal archives introduced a different kind of character here. Not a person, not even a department, but a process that dissolved accountability through diffusion. Requests passed between offices. Clerks redirected inquiries to storage facilities that no longer held what their indexes promised. Digital scans preserved cover sheets long after the originals had vanished. What unsettled me was not overt refusal, no stamped denials, no redacted paragraphs, just absence, decisions reduced to procedural inertia, questions softened into bureaucratic cul-de-sacs where curiosity lost momentum before it could become confrontation. Betrayal took shape not through action, but through neglect that felt too consistent to be random, large enough to reshape cities, quiet enough to leave no one officially responsible for remembering why. Renovation records completed the transformation in a way no flood map ever could, in filing cabinets and municipal databases. Buried floors stopped being mysteries and became categories. Basement conversions, foundation reinforcements, grade corrections. The vocabulary carried authority, not curiosity, reshaping the past with administrative calm. The bridge approaches offered the same lesson in slow revision. New ramps replaced shallow descents. Retaining walls swallowed decorative courses and recast them as structural necessities. What had once appeared ornamental was reclassified as utilitarian, its former visibility erased by language before it vanished beneath soil. Each update solved a modern problem while quietly overwriting an older one. Generational handoffs did the rest. Assessors learned from the documents left behind. Engineers inherited assumptions embedded in diagrams drawn decades earlier. Archivists cataloged revisions without ever seeing the versions that preceded them. The change was not sudden enough to provoke alarm. It was steady, cumulative, bureaucratic in its efficiency. The unease sharpened here, drifting away from geology and towards something more elusive. Not destruction, not disaster, but reinterpretation so thorough that it no longer registered as alteration at all. Cities did not forget because something dramatic had happened to them. They forgot because paperwork taught them how. By the time the evidence began to overlap, the question was no longer whether something unusual had occurred beneath these structures, but what combination of forces could produce such uniform results across centuries and continents. Geological surveys suggested flood deposition in some regions, yet the thickness and stratification did not always align with known river events. Urban redevelopment explained partial burial in expanding cities, but not in districts where streets had remained fixed for generations. Engineering reports described stabilization layers added long after construction, though rarely in quantities sufficient to swallow entire ground floors. I laid the explanations side by side and watched where they failed to meet. Each accounted for fragments. None accounted for the whole. The layers did not behave like isolated accidents. They behaved like a system, repeating in places with different climates, politics, and histories. The longer I studied the strata, the more they resembled a ledger rather than debris. Page after page of material added, compacted, forgotten. A record written in earth instead of ink. At that point, questions surfaced without invitation. What kind of process leaves cities wearing multiple pasts at once? How often does reinterpretation replace memory before anyone realizes something has shifted? And if the lower floors once belonged to open air, what does that suggest about the streets we now accept as original? I ended where most people begin. On bridges no one questions, and stairways no one measures anymore. Traffic rolled across stone arches whose lower courses were hidden behind concrete skirts and retaining walls. Office workers passed windows that opened onto nothing but soil, light wells trimmed to fit a world that had risen around them. These were not ruins. They were infrastructure, still bearing weight, still guiding movement, still accepted as ordinary. The continuity unsettled me more than any buried ornament ever had. Whatever had altered these elevations did not interrupt function. It had been absorbed, normalized, built over. The structures endured, while their origins blurred into footnotes and maintenance schedules. I stood there longer than necessary, watching water move beneath spans designed for a different street level, noticing how effortlessly modern life trusted foundations it no longer remembered. The layers below remained sealed, catalogued, renamed, rarely reopened. How many other crossings rest on similar revisions? How many city blocks sit atop earlier ground lines no one bothers to chart anymore? And how often does the present glide across the past without realizing that something fundamental has shifted beneath its feet?